Ed Schultz is a former MSNBC host who was one of the few standouts on the network who actually did their job and spoke truth to power. For example, he was, I believe, the only host on the network at the time that challenged Obama when he was pushing for the TPP. Additionally, he was one of the few hosts that wanted to actually cover Bernie Sanders' campaign. And presumably, since he wouldn't acquiesce to what the network clearly wanted, well, he was fired. And now, several years later, he's confirming what we suspected about MSNBC, that they have a very clear set of requirements with regard to what they expect from their hosts. Now, what he's saying is really a bombshell. So first and foremost, he clears up some misconceptions about RT, the network he's currently employed with. He states that this is his favorite job ever, and he has complete journalistic freedom to express himself there. Whereas with MSNBC, that wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, the president of MSNBC, Phil Griffin, often tried to control the content of their hosts.
And I want to make this very clear, and I hope your audience consumes this. There was more oversight and more direction given to me on content at MSNBC than there ever has been here at RT. And I think that it's very sad that that story is not getting out. I think it's many times I was told what to lead with on MSNBC. Many times I was told what I was not going to do, and I've got a story that, had I not been involved in it, I would have never believed it. And Phil Griffin, who I consider a friend to this day, was a watchdog, far more than anything I am exposed to here at RT America.
Did he tell you what to say? Did he tell you an angle to take?
Often.
So even though this really isn't too surprising, I find it fascinating because Phil Griffin, president of MSNBC, he controls the content or tries to control the content of his hosts often, but yet anyone in the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, they'll maintain that RT, since it receives funding from the Kremlin, is a propaganda network. But here you have a credible former MSNBC host confirming that it's actually RT that gives their hosts more intellectual freedom. Now, he has a really explicit example as to how the president of MSNBC tried to keep their hosts on a leash. Now, he talks about the launch of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign and what happened when he tried to cover Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign.
When Bernie Sanders was announcing that he was going to be a candidate for the nomination of the Democratic Party in Burlington, Vermont, I was the only cable host between Fox, MSNBC, and CNN that was there live to cover it. Now, there were live cameras there, but we had coordinated with the Sanders campaign that at 5 o'clock he was going to make his announcement, and we were going to cover this on the Ed Show. I go to Bernie Sanders' house that afternoon, an interview in the backyard, about a 15-minute interview. The grandkids are running around. It's a big day for the Sanders family. He's going to announce that he's running for president. We're going to carry it live later on in the day, and we're going to run this one-on-one tape with Bernie. 3,000 people are there on Lake Champlain. It's 5 minutes to air, and I get a phone call from Phil Griffin, "You're not covering this." I said, "Phil, Bernie Sanders is announcing he's running for president. He's going to be a president. I don't care. You're not covering this." And it got rather contentious. And
Why, though?
I don't, well, now you're asking me for opinion. I'm giving you fact right now about what happened. Mm-hmm. And other people who were there with me will attest to the fact and back me up that this is what happened. We were told that we had to cover something down in Texas that was totally meaningless, and another press conference in Baltimore, which was already had been in the news for a few days. We're covering Bernie Sanders live. We're coordinated with his campaign. And I'm told 5 minutes before, you're not covering Bernie Sanders. Now, let me give you the opinion. I think the Clintons were connected to Andy Lack, connected at the hip. I think that they didn't want anybody in their prime time or anywhere in their lineup supporting Bernie Sanders. I think that they were in the tank for Hillary Clinton, and I think it was managed, and 45 days later I was out at MSNBC. And I thought it stunk. They gave me my contract. I signed a non-disclosure agreement and also a no bad-mouthing agreement, which I felt good with because I thought that this was over time all going to wash out. And I knew if Bernie Sanders didn't win, he was going to run again because the man is determined. So I was patient and took my money and went on. But the fact of the matter is I think I've got a hell of a story to tell. And when you see how the campaign unfolded, Donna Brazile feeding Hillary Clinton questions at the campaign, the DNC undercutting Bernie Sanders, the superdelegates that were organized by Hillary Clinton. I mean, in my state of Minnesota, where I'm a resident and pay taxes, Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar were superdelegates, and despite the fact that Bernie Sanders won Minnesota, they supported Clinton. It was the fix was in. The fix was in with the mainstream media. The fix was in with managing the news and shutting down Bernie Sanders. And it wasn't until he started matching the Clintons and raising money that he became, well, we got to cover this guy. But from the start, the Clintons didn't want any competition. They didn't want Bernie Sanders around. They didn't want the Keystone XL pipeline. They didn't want to push her on that issue. They didn't want to push her on free education for all, and they certainly didn't want to push her on the TPP and also universal health care. Those were four main issues that Bernie Sanders, had he not been in the campaign, Hillary Clinton would have never had to address. And so I think the fix was in early on to Deep Six Bernie. To this day, it kind of pisses me off because they talk about collusion. There's nothing more than collusion than this.
And that's what progressives have been saying from the very beginning. There's your collusion right there. Hillary Clinton's campaign colluding with media executives to suppress information about Bernie Sanders' campaign. Now, we don't necessarily have evidence that Phil Griffin and Hillary Clinton were colluding specifically to silence Ed Schultz here, but we do know that Phil Griffin, his name did come up a couple of times in John Podesta's emails when they were released by WikiLeaks. So certainly, it's the case that there was very much a blackout of Bernie Sanders' campaign. And when we talked about this blackout of Bernie Sanders' coverage in 2016, we were called conspiracy theorists. And here we have now a former credible MSNBC host confirming what was obvious. Yes, there was very much a blackout. Now, if you don't trust Ed Schultz, well, there's another credible former MSNBC host that has a similar story about how MSNBC tries to do propaganda on behalf of the establishment, because back in 2011, when Cenk Uygur of TYT left MSNBC, he talked about a very interesting meeting he had with the president of MSNBC.
I got pulled in, and they told me, hey, listen, we were just, or it was actually one specific person, the head of MSNBC. He said, I was just in Washington, and people in Washington tell me that they're concerned about your tone. I was like, whoa, what? You know, despite all the things that I've said about the mainstream media, I still viewed that as kind of like theoretical. Like, a real person, are they really going to say that? I was like, and I'm naively thinking, what does he mean? Did he talk to his friend Bob in Washington? But why would you say people in Washington if you meant, oh yeah, I was talking to my buddy down at the shop about you. It just happened to be that he was a person in Washington. You wouldn't frame it that way, right? But I'm still thinking that. And then he gives me the second part of the speech. Hey, listen, Cenk, outsiders are cool. And they wear, I think he might have said something like, they wear leather jackets, they ride bikes. I think I'm an outsider, I don't ride a bike. But I have a terrible leather jacket. Anyway, he said, I'd love to be an outsider, outsiders are cool. But we're not. We're insiders. We are the establishment. And I just kind of sat back. I was like, wow, this is it. This is the speech. So he said, look, you got to tone it down. And then he had me talk to one of their top contributors who explained, hey, listen, just take it easy. You know, you're a little tough on the guests and, you know, tone issues, and let's have more Republicans on, which was an interesting thing.
Now, let me remind you that the media is supposed to challenge the power establishment in Washington, D.C., but here you have Phil Griffin, the president of the so-called liberal news network, telling Cenk that they are the establishment. They are the power core in the United States of America. So when you hear about this liberal media myth, there's no such thing as liberal media. All we have is establishment media that does the bidding of the Democratic Party. That's what MSNBC is. They are the propaganda wing of the Democratic Party in the same way that Fox News is the propaganda arm of the Republican Party. But just because MSNBC is brazenly, I think, doing the bidding of the Democratic Party establishment, that doesn't make them liberal. Because to suggest that means that the Democratic Party establishment itself is liberal, when they're not liberal. They're very much conservative, centrist at best, and the best that we get out of some Democrats is that they're center-left. So this is why the Overton window in the country has shifted so far to the right. It's because the mainstream media, they're not doing their job. They are doing everything in their power to suppress actual progressives. Ed Schultz was chewed out by the president of what's supposed to be the left-leaning network when he tried to cover the launch of Bernie Sanders' campaign. How absurd is that? Is this surprising news? Absolutely not. But it's certainly a bombshell, and I hope that we'll get a response from MSNBC, but certainly I don't think they really care, because so long as they appease their corporate advertisers, which happen to be the same donors who are giving to the Democratic Party, then that's all that they care about. So, yeah, mainstream media, it's all about propping up the establishment and the status quo. Not surprising, but certainly when we hear about the specifics, the situation is a lot worse than I think a lot of us previously thought.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.